Okay. Mr. Tharoor, thank you very much for your time. I was wondering, we have this conference now in Srebrenica 20 years after. You were very much involved with the UN, you were working there. From your UN perspective, and also in the perspective of the call for UN reform, how important do you think this conference is?
I think it's very important. To some degree I wish it had happened earlier, say 10 years ago and not 20 years after the event, because for many of us recalling everything we thought, remembered, knew, believed, felt at that time becomes progressively more difficult with the passage of so many years. But the fact that this exercise needs to be done and needed to be done is beyond dispute. And what I found particularly useful about the conference is it's conducted in a very, very professional atmosphere, very sober, sensible discussion, and at the same time with a tremendous amount of detail. A lot of documentation has been assembled that sometimes helps some of us to remember some of the things we wrote and said at the time, and at the same time the people who are participating themselves have additional information from their own involvement, which has collectively led to an extremely useful exercise. The usefulness, however, is limited in the sense that it's not enough for us to learn lessons. Lessons must be learned by those who might make such decisions in the future. And it's not clear that that will happen because they're not the ones around the table. Everybody here exercised a certain responsibility at the time. But when tomorrow's next crisis comes along, would, for example, the Security Council again find it convenient to shove peacekeepers in where there is no peace to keep? Would there again be doctrinal disputes about dual keys and conflicts of authority between different organizations? Would there again be fundamental issues about deployment patterns versus the use of force? These are the things that ideally those making the decision, say in the Security Council or the highest echelons of the UN Secretariat or of NATO, would need to be familiar with. So I certainly hope that the product of this deliberation is taken seriously by those who might make similar decisions in the future. And that is the only thing I wish I could be more confident about.
So you would advise those in charge now at the United Nations to take the recommendations of this conference that will be published later this year very seriously?
I would urge that the recommendations be studied not just by those who are in charge now, but those who are in charge years from now. I mean, the value of such an exercise is that it is a portrait of a particular period of time, but its lessons are valid for the indefinite future. And certainly, I think there are some of these core principles that need to be laid out, which in my view will remain valid as long as governments are going to be making such decisions. I mean, there is a problem, for example, that the Security Council finds itself very often making decisions on resolutions as a diplomatic end in themselves, rather than worrying about the operational feasibility of a resolution. Whereas the soldiers on the ground then have to implement a resolution in the middle of an ongoing crisis in feasible military terms, not in terms that the diplomats were trying to hammer out in New York. These sorts of things, if governments can be made aware of what the consequences are in terms of human lives, perhaps they won't make these mistakes again. But it's a big perhaps.
Mr. Tharoor, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.